I want to thank the League of Women Voters of Wisconsin for inviting me to talk about non-US citizen voting in the United States. I also want to profusely apologize for missing your convention where I was supposed to give this presentation. Anyways, I've decided to go ahead and record it and make it available and welcome you to contact me if you have any questions. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. Start the presentation from the beginning. My name is Marguerite Edelman, and I serve as the Vice President for the League of Women Voters of Vermont, and also have been the chair of the Non-US Citizen Voting Committee that we have been holding for the past 2 years. One of the reasons I was so interested in this topic is that I live in a refugee resettlement community. And I'll talk a little bit about that more later and how it applies to this particular topic. So I really feel it's important to understand a little bit of the history of non-US citizen voting in the United States. It's not like this is a new thing, folks. When America was first settled and voting rights were initially limited to white male property owners, race, class, gender, not citizenship, was what really mattered in voting and in holding any offices. At that time in history, over 40 states or territories had some form of non-US citizen voting in elections. So we've evolved and changed over time, and that's to be expected in a democracy. What is also important to know is that federal law, only federal law, prohibits voting to non-US citizens in federal elections only. So once again, the idea of states and municipalities having autonomy was very important historically, and continues to be important. We see that in rulings on all sorts of pieces of legislation. However, there are state constitutions, many of them more recently, that have actually banned non-US citizens from voting. And I understand that Wisconsin also has such an item coming up for a constitutional change. I'll show you some of the states that have currently banned non-US citizen voting. And there are 7 states. We have Arizona, North Dakota, Colorado, Florida, Alabama, Ohio, and Louisiana. So the way they wrote their amended their constitutions, they did not allow non-US citizens to vote at the state or the municipal level. But as I mentioned, I think all but 2 of these are very, very recent changes to the US Constitution, to the state constitution, as a result of the interest in this particular topic. However, there are a lot of places where non-US citizen voting is being considered. Boston has been looking at the issue for a while. Chicago, Portland, Maine, San Jose, California, Santa Ana, California, Worcester, Massachusetts, and Syracuse, New York. And I'm sure I've missed some. What I do is kind of keep a Google alert on this particular topic so I can stay abreast of what's happening across the country. There are a lot of US cities with non-US citizen voting, and there seems to be more and more interest in this issue. 11 cities in Maryland have some form of non-US citizen voting, and Tacoma Park has had this for 30 years, some for even much longer. 3 cities in Vermont. I'm going to talk about my city a little later. San Francisco, California, which allows non-US citizens to vote in school board elections. Oakland, New York City, although that's still in the courts, and the District of Columbia. So we're seeing a kind of movement in the direction of allowing non-US citizens to vote. Now, where they can vote at the local level, in some cities, they can only vote in school elections, city elections, or in both. And there's different reasons for that. And it depends a lot on the particular state. And in some cities, non-US citizens can run for local, city, and or school board positions. So often you'll find that depending on the particular municipality, city, and its particular jurisdictions, that you might have quite different rules in one city to another. Here in Vermont, we have a city where you can vote in, well, two cities where you can vote in both the school board and the city election. But in one city, because it has a combined school district with another community, the non-US citizens are not allowed to vote in the school district election. So there's a lot of complications and differences that we see across the board with this particular topic. Now, the other thing to remember is that cities give this a different name. In Winooski, we call it all resident voting. However, in Burlington, they call it all legal resident voting. And in Montpelier, the other city in Vermont that has it, it's just called non-citizen voting. So you really kind of need to use a number of different terms when you're talking about this. One reason we started saying non-US citizen is that we heard from various immigrant groups that people are a citizen somewhere. So we shouldn't say non-citizen, we should say non-US citizen. So there's clarification in that. What you see on the screen is a picture of Winooski. It's a very small community overall. We're just a little over 1 square mile, which is not particularly big. However, because we are a refugee resettlement community, we have a very diverse population. We're part of the Burlington area, and we are the most diverse community in Vermont, in the US, in Vermont, I'm sorry, and in our region in the US. And, you know, technically Vermont is a small state, probably the whitest state in the Union, but our area is not. We have more than 20 languages that are spoken in our school district. Children in our schools come from many countries around the world. And here's just a few facts. Our population of over 18 is 6,131. Our native US citizens are 82%. Our naturalized citizens are 8%. And those who are not US citizens are 10%. So that's about 618 people that could be registered to vote as non-US citizens if they're here legally. We'll talk a little bit more about that. And they are permanent residents. And you get a little information about our general income here and the percentage of residents living in poverty. We probably have one of the higher poverty rates in the state of Vermont. So what is the process that you have to undergo to get non-US citizen voting? Well, you have to be pretty passionate and committed to want this to happen in your community. The first thing that has to happen is either your city council, and I'm talking specifically about Vermont, but I assume it's a similar process in other states. Your city council has to decide that this is something they see as part of their charter, their mission for their community. And the other way is that a public citizens group can also bring the idea forward to get it eventually put on the town meeting day ballot, the election ballot, as a question at that time. But this is the process we used. The city council, after one failure of getting non-US citizens voting in Winooski, created a charter commission. And the Charter Commission got input from the public on a number of changes that it wanted to make to our particular city charter. When they got all that input and provided a lot of education to the community around the concept of non-US citizen voting, they then put it on our ballot. Okay, and if people voted yes, that they wanted to allow or welcome non-US citizens in Winooski who were permanent residents to vote, they voted yes. And once that happened, it went way down here to the Vermont House and Senate. And each of those bodies had to approve the changes that our particular community wanted to make in its charter. And they did. And then they passed it up to the governor. And the governor also had to approve it. Ironically, he vetoed it. So it had to go back to the House and the Senate for an override. And our House and Senate did override the governor's veto. And we ended up with all resident voting here in Winooski. So it's a complicated process, and it takes a great deal of commitment on the part of the city and educating the public in that particular municipality city to get it through the entire range of that process. So this is the guidelines that we have in Winooski for who can vote, okay? So it has to be a resident who's here on a federally sanctioned legal category. That could be a green card, a visa, a permanent visa, etc. And they have to be 18 years old, just like a regular voter, or older by election day. They have to reside in Winooski with the intent to stay. People often ask me, what does that mean? Well, it's a surprisingly loose definition. And that's not just true in Vermont, it's true across the whole country. Most places don't have residency requirements that, say you have to be there more than 30 days. So, or some have none. I would say the majority of states have absolutely no clear definition of residency requirements. But, here, that's our definition with the intent to stay. Qualified residents can vote in all local elections and run for local offices. So in Winooski, they can run for the school board and they can vote in the school board election and on the budget, and the same for the city. And this is true across Vermont. The city must maintain a state voter list and a federal voter registration list. And they're going to be different, and a different municipal voter registration list. So the municipal one will contain the non-US citizen voters, and the other one is for major elections. So that implies, and it's true, that we have two different ballots. If there are things that our non-US citizens can vote on in any election, then there's a ballot for them, and then there's a ballot for everyone else. So it can, once again, the education of people around that is hard, but it's not like they can vote on state and federal issues. They can only vote on the local municipal issues and offices. So what were the politics here? Well, the Winooski charter vote was taken in November of 2020. And we had 2,479 votes in favor of the charter change to allow non-US citizens to vote. That was 71%. And the charter change was approved by the House, as I said. The governor vetoed it, saying it was unfair to have different voting rules in different communities. And then the House and the Senate overrode the veto. And right after that, a number of lawsuits were filed against all of these cities. And they were eventually dismissed, and the changes were found constitutional by the Vermont Supreme Court. So at this point, the challenges have stopped, and it's institutionalized here in Vermont. We expect these three communities, the latest one being Burlington, Vermont, to continue with non-US citizen voting. So one of the biggest challenges is educating non-US citizen voters. Every community can choose how much or how little it wants to do in this area. Truthfully, some of our communities are doing a great deal. Winooski has gone out of its way in order to educate and involve non-US citizens in the electoral process. Other communities have done considerably less. And you know, how much you do and how much you spend on making this accessible to your population is really, you know, dependent on that particular city council, that particular community, in terms of what they want to do for outreach. We pride ourselves in Winooski on diversity and inclusion. We've hired a diversity coordinator, and we have worked hard in Winooski to reach out to non-US citizens. Many of our ballots and our materials for non-US citizens are in 8 languages. That tells you how diverse our community is. And when we first began non-US citizen voting, after it was approved, we started registering non-US citizens. We had community presentations where we invited many of the community organizations and groups that worked with and catered to our non-US citizen populations to attend, and hire translators to work with those non-US citizens. The city created educational videos, and they did a lot of outreach to immigrant associations. So this is what Winooski did, but other communities have not done this much here or in other parts of the country, like Maryland. Oh, I think I got to go back one, sorry. So in our first election with all resident voting, it was March 1st, 2022. And on election day that year, 17 non-US citizens voted. And the total number of registered voters was, as I said before, 5,218. The total number of people who voted was only 938. And all of us in the league should be very concerned about how few people vote at the municipal local level. The total number of non-US citizens who were registered to vote by that particular election was 56. And since then, I think it's gone up to 61, 62. And if you remember, I think we had 500 plus that were eligible to register to vote. So there are lots of arguments for and against non-US citizen voting. It is clearly a controversial topic across the country. I get editorials, I get articles all the time on arguments for and arguments against it. And these are just some of the basic arguments against it. And I'm not going to share them all, but I'll leave them up on the screen so you can read them. So non-citizens have to self-identify, which could put them at risk for immigration action. One argument against it. The county clerk becomes a keeper of immigration info, which could result in deportations, etc. The major argument is this one: citizenship is a privilege, and it comes with the opportunities of voting, which shouldn't be given to non-US citizens. Voting is a right for citizens, and many non-US citizens eligible for citizenship are motivated to apply for citizenship in order to vote. In other words, if you give them the vote early, they're not going to go for citizenship. Issues faced by non-US citizens are different from those of citizens, and they're more appropriately addressed by citizens, not by non-citizens. Non-US citizen voting might encourage those who are here illegally to register as a legal non-US citizen resident and vote. Non-US citizen residents who may not speak English or be able to read could have their votes easily manipulated by others. Large numbers of non-US citizen residents voting could change the outcome of an election. Non-US citizens may move to communities that allow non-US citizen voting, then they'll change the culture and nature of that community. And procedures for non-US citizen voting cost the community money. including lawsuits, translations, interpreters, processing, separate voter registration forms, reconfiguring web pages, and more. So you can see there's a lot of arguments against them. I'm not going to counter them, but in your own mind, you might be able to counter some of those. And the same with the arguments for non-US citizen voting. You may be able to see ways that these should be countered as well. So here are the arguments for it. Non-US citizens own property, pay taxes, contribute to our local economy, and should have a voice in local government. Here in Winooski, a large number of businesses in our community are owned by non-US citizens. We have ethnic restaurants, we have ethnic grocery stores, we have a lot of other businesses that are owned by non-US citizens and really contribute to the livelihood of Winooski. Non-US citizens are affected by policies and actions of municipal and county government, the same as citizens. In fact, many people will argue that it's at the local level that you have the ability to make the most changes, and that it's local changes that affect your life the most. And so if you have children in school, the next argument, and you're affected by the policies of the school district, you should have a voice there. The citizenship process is costly, takes many years, and has an application, sorry about this, that is cumbersome and difficult. So our local economies depend on immigrant and refugee labor. Non-US citizen participation benefits everyone in the community. Non-US citizen voting was really common at the local, state, and even federal level, historically. Maybe not women, but certainly, men and men property owners often have that right. And in some countries, residency, not citizenship, is seen as the measure of being a legitimate stakeholder in a community. This is an argument that I've seen quite a bit. Voting rights are part of the social contract. A just government rests on the consent of the government. The vote helps guard against discrimination and political exclusion. The majority of Vermont's immigrants are educated and speak English. Interestingly enough, the majority of our statewide immigrants are from Canada. Voting participation is correlated to the voting rate of one's parents. So if you obtain citizenship, which takes a number of years, but you allow parents to vote earlier at the municipal level, their children are going to be more likely to vote. And we definitely need more voters in our country. So here are some interesting questions about where do we draw the line and why. This has come up quite a bit recently in the federal election issue. Pregnant foreigners can travel to the US on a visa and have their baby here. The child is then granted US citizenship by birthright. Is this fair? In fact, many of those foreigners, might be quite wealthy and just come over here to deliver the baby so that their children have the right to claim that birthright. Legal non-US citizens are subject to selective service, and they can even be drafted. So why can't they vote if they can give their life for their country? Non-US citizens can and do serve in the US military, but citizenship is not guaranteed to them for doing so. Should it be? And many states don't have meaningful residency requirements for citizens to vote. 23 states have absolutely no residency requirements, and many others have around 30 days, which I mentioned earlier. And the US allows citizens to hold multiple passports, as do many other countries. Should they be allowed to vote if they are residing in another country? So lots of interesting questions can be asked around this particular issue. Here in Vermont, our league did finally at our convention decide to support non-US citizen voting after studying the issue and looking at Boulder, Colorado's research on the topic. And what we decided that we would do, this is our kind of goal, is educate individuals about non-US citizen voting. Obviously, register non-US citizens in the communities that have approved it, and work with any community that is interested in securing voting rights for their non-US citizen residents. So that was the conclusion of our study. At this point, we've created a new brochure on non-US citizen voting in Vermont. We're working to make a video with one of our local school districts, actually the Winooski School District, and the students there on non-US citizen voting. So that's my presentation on the topic. I'm sure you have many questions, and discussion is relevant as well. I would say from my research that, and what I've seen and what I've read, that it's really dependent on a community, which direction it goes. Communities with a large percentage of non-US citizens might consider it, like Winooski, and other communities may not. You know, I think it's going to be a number of years before we'd ever see something at a national level. But at least now at the state level, various municipalities can make their own decisions on this topic. So if you're interested and have questions, please don't hesitate to contact me at the email on the screen. I'd be happy to answer them. And thank you so much. You know, I'll be watching with great interest to see what happens in Wisconsin on your constitutional amendment question.